Hi, I'm Andrew Rodriguez, and this is PsychoBible. We've been going over a series of myths and misunderstandings about so-called conversion therapy, and really addressing more recently the myths about professional therapy for unwanted same-sex attraction. We've gone over the term conversion therapy and the proper terms to use instead. We've gone over the coercion myth, and then last time was the harm myth. So that brings us to our last of the major myths, and that is the ineffectiveness myth, which is the idea that therapy for unwanted same-sex attraction is pseudoscientific, it's ineffective, it doesn't benefit people in any way, at least with the goal of changing orientation to some extent. So we often hear this claim that it's been debunked, it's been disproven, that it doesn't work, or we hear people with the same-sex attraction themselves saying, I don't need to be repaired, usually as their reaction to hearing about reparative therapy, which is a misunderstanding of the term. Or they just claim that it's just behavior modification. You're not really changing the attractions in any way, or you're just changing behaviors and you're forcing them to suppress it all. It's just suppression. You're forcing them to go back into the closet. So these are all the different accusations that come with this ineffectiveness myth. And this idea that it's been disproven or debunked, well, you would think that there'd be a ton of research to really back up that claim. Unfortunately, that's not the case. So before we can really get into that, we have to take a bit of a step back, and even though the purpose of this series isn't to discuss homosexuality in and of itself, but just primarily therapy for unwanted homosexual attractions and behavior, we do need to sort of discuss some dynamics of homosexuality and the nature and definition of it, okay? So first, you have to understand that there are dimensions of homosexuality, or dimensions of sexual orientation. I'm not just making this up. Modern researchers on homosexuality have come to the realization that we can't just talk about homosexuality in terms of attraction or just in terms of behavior, but really there are at least three major dimensions of sexual orientation that we have to consider. So first, there's the attraction, or also physical arousal, sexual arousal. There's the identity, or self-label, which I would prefer to say, self-label or self-concept. And then there's behavior, which could include anything ranging from pornography to sexual acts to romantic relationships and the different styles of relationships in the LGBT community. Now, the main belief of opponents of SOCE, or change-allowing therapies, is that same-sex attraction is immutable, meaning that it cannot change. It's stable throughout time. And this is rooted in the born that way myth, which we're not going to go into in depth, but it's basically the idea that you're biologically determined to be either homosexual in orientation, heterosexual in orientation, or bisexual in orientation. Instead, for both opponents and advocates of sexual orientation change, it might be more helpful to think of sexual attraction similar to personality, which is complex and multifactorial as far as what develops and causes our personality traits. Just like personality, it tends to evolve naturally and emerge. You don't start off with an attraction one way or the other. It sort of evolves naturally as you go through the lifespan. Now, it's said there is a normative developmental pathway, so there is an objective goal at the end of adolescence and young adulthood that you would arrive at a particular sexual orientation. However, LGBT activists would probably argue more that there is no normative sexual development. Instead, all outcomes are healthy and normal. And to both sides of the argument, just like personality, I would argue that change in attraction, just like change in personality traits, is possible but not easy. There have been a growing number of voices in the realm of sexual psychology that have been calling for a paradigm shift. The traditional paradigm has been viewing sexual orientation as strict categories. You're either gay, bi, or straight, and they don't really cross over. And that's a false view. The categorical view is false. Instead, it's more accurate to view sexual attraction or on a continuum. This actually goes back to Alfred Kinsey. In the way he would study sexual attraction or homosexuality was to use a scale from 0 to 6. 0 meaning completely heterosexual in attractions and behavior, to decreasing levels of homosexual until you got to 6, which was exclusively homosexual. And we also find that those in the mostly group are the largest. The ones who are mostly homosexual but have some heterosexual experience or attraction, even if it's just incidental. They are much larger than those who are exclusively same-sex attracted. We're increasingly finding data that supports the idea of sexual attraction fluidity. The idea that it ebbs and flows or goes through cycles, or it's not necessarily static and stable. The biggest proponent of this sexual attraction fluidity idea is Dr. Lisa Diamond, a lesbian psychologist. Her research shows that sexual attraction tends to change rather organically without concerted effort, particularly for adolescents, and it is increasing research that shows that it occurs more often for women as well. Although there is some research that shows even for men, sexual fluidity is possible. What you often don't hear is that the fluidity, when left on its own, flows toward heterosexuality, and particularly for adolescents. Increasingly, the research shows that when you measure sexual identity for adolescents at 1 year, you interview those same clients a couple years down the road, that those who claimed a LGBT identification earlier in adolescence, by the time they reach adulthood, are now arriving at a heterosexual identity. So the trend is actually toward heterosexuality. But the way the research is often promoted or communicated is as if it's all up for grabs. Now, Lisa Diamond, even though she has been promoting and really putting out the research that shows how change in attraction is possible, is very adamant to say that that we still should not try to change attractions. We shouldn't be using therapy to try and change attractions. Now, she doesn't say this because of any actual scientific reason, but really out of ideological reasons. Mostly because she realizes that the consequence of her research is really giving validity to sexual orientation change efforts. So when we talk about sexual orientation change, we should bear a few things in mind, and that's for both opponents and advocates. First is that change can occur on any of the dimensions of orientation, with the identity or self-label, with the various behaviors, and with the attractions. Now, of course, the third one, the attractions, is the big one. That's the one that really matters to people. And it's really because they're coming from this perspective that your attraction is what determines your identity. That if you are attracted, you have a desire for something, that is your true self. Whereas other people from other value systems may say, hey, you could be attracted or have desires for all sorts of things. But as humans, we have agency. Therefore, our attractions shouldn't be what determines all of our behaviors. So there's a bit of a value difference between that shows who would be the ones more likely to pursue sexual orientation change. Next, if we're going to discard the paradigm of a categorical view of orientation, that you're either gay, straight, or bisexual, but instead view it as degrees of same-sex attraction, then we ought to understand that change in attraction is on a continuum as well. So therefore, the most successful outcomes of sexual orientation change efforts or sexual attraction fluidity exploration therapy would be increased opposite sex attraction, either building upon existing OSA or for the client to experience OSA for the first time ever in their lives. Moving down, you can have a decrease in same-sex attraction, that it may lose some of its intensity and impulsivity. Also, there could be a stronger heterosexual self-concept, as well as improved well-being. So those have been different positive outcomes or indicators of successful treatment. What you will find is there is a lot of ignored research. Prior to the 1990s, homosexuality was treated regularly, and it was documented through case studies and then anecdotal evidence through participants in counseling for same-sex attraction or through ex-gay ministries. For the counseling approaches, we had a number of documented cases of change using psychoanalysis as well as behavior therapy. But with the growing trend in society toward affirming homosexuality and demonizing those who hold to traditional sexuality, there's now a scarcity of counselors willing to approach this issue, let alone be trained in approaches to actually help people explore their heterosexual potential. In the APA's 2009 Task Force Report on Sexual Orientation, they ultimately concluded that there's not enough rigorous studies of modern therapies to determine effectiveness. Don't believe me? Let me read from page 43. Given the limited amount of methodologically sound research, we cannot draw a conclusion regarding whether recent forms of SOCE are or are not effective. So even though everyone will say the APA has shown and proven that change therapies are ineffective and they've been disproven and debunked, the APA itself acknowledges that there's not enough research to back up a claim for effectiveness or ineffectiveness. Now, they're saying there's not enough evidence to show that it's effective, but they actually were ignoring quite a number of studies that didn't fit their criteria. And, on top of that, since the 2009 report, there's been a number of studies that have come out showing effectiveness. According to the clinicians in this field, the common claim, such as from Joseph Nicolosi Sr., was a third. Meaning, the outcomes in his therapy was a third complete change from homosexual to now heterosexual functioning and attractions, to a third who experienced significant change or a significant progress and decrease of same-sex attraction and maybe the start of some opposite-sex attraction, to a third, no change, no benefit from the therapy. So this is what Dr. Nicolosi, the one who everyone claims said there's a gay cure and always promised change, he never even promised change. He would always say that the common outcome is a third complete change, a third significant change, and a third no change. So even though the most radical results in sexual orientation change are very rare, it's hard to predict who will most benefit from therapy for this issue. And the gay cure was not promised. So let's take a brief look at several studies that show change in attraction being possible on a continuum. In 2000, you had Nicolosi, Byrd, and Potts, a retrospective survey of 882 participants in therapy. After therapy, over 34% reported a shift from exclusive homosexual to exclusively or mostly heterosexual. Before therapy, 67% were exclusively homosexual. After therapy, 12.8% were exclusively homosexual. So you see a shift along the continuum. In 2002, Byrd and Nicolosi did a meta-analysis of 146 different studies. Most were from before 1975. They found that therapy for homosexuality was 79% more effective than an alternative therapy or control groups. Shidlow and Schroeder, 2002. Originally, of course, this was the study put out to document therapeutic harm and failure, but even in this study, of the 202 respondents, 26 reported success. And they showed shifts in all dimensions toward heterosexuality. So even in a study that was aimed at documenting the harm of therapy, they still found claims of success. Then there's the infamous study by Robert Spitzer from 2003. He was the key psychiatrist in removing homosexuality from the DSM. But fortunately, he was honest enough that when he continued to hear reports of people claiming to have changed their orientation or having been benefited from ex-gay ministries and other therapies for unwanted same-sex attraction, he figured the best thing to do would be to investigate those claims. So he interviewed 143 men and 57 women who did some form of SOCE. Now, this was all self-report and retrospective. Keep that in mind, of course. But he found that before therapy, 46% of the men and 42% of the women claimed to be exclusively same-sex attracted. Post-therapy, 17% of the men and 54% of women claimed to have exclusive opposite-sex attraction. So he did find that there's evidence of change. Of course, it was on a continuum, and those who had the greatest degree of change were, of course, in the minority, which is often the case that's reported. Now, this report came under extreme fire because of being the person who was instrumental in removing homosexuality from the DSM. All the gay activists considered him a traitor for even investigating this issue and helping provide proof that change may be possible. So he ended up, prior to his death, writing a type of regret report. He didn't actually retract his findings. His findings were actually quite sound, but he tried to change the narrative a bit. Carton, 2006, study of 117 men. Pre-therapy, the average man was predominantly homosexual. Post-therapy, the average was predominantly heterosexual or equally both. In 2011, Stanton Jones and Mark Yarhouse finished their longitudinal study of 61 participants in Exodus Ministries. Now, Exodus was formerly the umbrella organization for ex-gay ministries. So within there, you have support groups and pastoral counseling as well as professional therapy. So there are a variety of approaches that fall under that umbrella. 23% experience a shift from same-sex attraction to opposite-sex attraction. And the majority experienced some degree of change, even if it was on continuum, and even if those who had the greatest degree of change were the minority. Now, when Exodus North America closed, Alan Chambers, the final president, made a claim that 99.9% of people he knows haven't changed. That inspired Stephen Black, the director of First Stone Ministries, one of the first ministries that are part of Exodus, to go back and look through all of their cases and begin a survey of all their former clients, to find out how effective their program was in helping people with their concerns about their same-sex attraction. So in 2018, he published the Effectiveness Survey based off 185 former participants who spanned from 1990 to 2015. 23% reported a complete elimination of same-sex attraction, and the majority reported a change in behavior and sexual addiction. In 2018, Santero, Whitehead, and Ballesteros published a report of 125 men, 97% were in professional therapy, and most were doing some form of professional therapy along with some other religious type of intervention. 68% reported some to much reduction in same-sex attraction and homosexual behavior, and an increase in opposite-sex attraction. 18% felt opposite-sex attraction for the very first time in their lives, and 14% had experienced a complete change. They also did a comparison study to see that the success in orientation change was comparable to success in treatment for other mental health and drug and alcohol issues. So despite these studies, what we often hear from the APA and other critics of sexual orientation change efforts and change therapies is still this myth that is ineffective. So unfortunately, this issue has become so ideological and politicized that there's a significant lack of research to back up claims one way or the other. There's hardly anyone willing to do the research, and the research that exists is subjected to way more scrutiny than any research on almost any other topic in psychology. More rigor is demanded for SOCE and safety than therapy for any other issue. Critics pretty much would say that they would only be satisfied if they can get some sort of proof that people have categorically changed from, and if they ever see indication that someone still has some degree of same-sex attraction, they just say, aha, see, they didn't change at all, or they're just going back in the closet, they're just suppressing their desires, they're not embracing their authentic self, or they would say, so, they were bisexual all along, you didn't change anything. But the reality is, change along the continuum is still successful. Would we ever use such rigorous standards for success regarding any other issue in psychology? Take alcohol, for example. If you were dealing with an alcohol addiction, but you started treatment, you started working on the root issues, you worked on sobriety so that you wouldn't continue to drink, you stopped hanging around people who would influence you to drink, you developed better coping skills so that you wouldn't act out when tempted, or you would make a note of different triggers so that you would avoid them and find ways to reduce their impact on your life. And you say maybe join a support group or 12-step group, and maybe you get to the point of 20 years clean and sober. And for the most part, alcohol isn't even on your mind. It's not a temptation for the most part, and you're living quite happily sober. But then maybe, on occasion, maybe under certain circumstances, because of maybe stress or maybe certain memories being triggered, you can find yourself tempted to drink. And maybe even on occasionally you slip up and you have a relapse. Would you ever say to that person, see, therapy was ineffective. You complete failure. Didn't work at all. No, even with acting out again, we would still say, it's okay. Relapse is part of the journey. It's part of recovery. We would never say, see, just give up. Just embrace who you are. You're an alcoholic. That's your identity. Be your authentic self and just start drinking again. Who cares about these moral rules and social stigma and societal standards? Embrace it. Let's work to reduce stigma against alcoholism, and let's help everyone to just be a safe alcoholic. Would we ever say that? No, because we as a culture value sobriety at least enough that if someone chooses to stop drinking, we would actually encourage their decision. But when it comes to homosexuality, we would be quick to say, you're denying your true self. And the moment they slip, they're condemned and told that, see, of course you're going to mess up. You're just suppressing your true nature. Even though there's no evidence to show a biological determinism. So it's a completely unfair and unrealistic standard. And it really has to end. In a pluralistic society, we ought to allow options. And if people want to change, that shouldn't be offensive to those who don't want to change. As long as the treatment itself is done ethically and professionally. So that's the last of the major myths. I have a couple side topics I'm going to get to as well. So stay tuned. And as usual, hit that like button, subscribe, share, and join me in the comments section. Thank you. God bless.